brief history of fraud. Introduction to fraud: understanding the basics. Fraud is a deliberate act of deception or misrepresentation that is conducted for financial gain or other benefits. It is a type of criminal activity that can take many forms, including embezzlement, identity theft, and investment scams, among others. Fraud can be committed by individuals, businesses, or even governments, and it can have serious consequences for victims, including financial losses, damaged reputations, and legal troubles. Understanding the basics of fraud is important because it helps individuals and organizations recognize and avoid fraudulent activity. This involves understanding the different types of fraud, the methods that fraudsters use to carry out their schemes, and the warning signs that indicate that fraud may be occurring. One of the key factors that makes fraud difficult to detect is that it often involves the use of deception and manipulation. Fraudsters may use a variety of tactics, including false documentation, impersonation, and social engineering, to gain the trust of their victims and hide their fraudulent activities. In some cases, fraudsters may even enlist the help of other individuals or organizations in carrying out their schemes. Another important aspect of understanding fraud is recognizing the different types of fraud that exist. For example, investment fraud involves tricking individuals into investing in fraudulent or non-existent investment opportunities, while healthcare fraud may involve billing for services that were not actually provided. Other types of fraud include credit card fraud, insurance fraud, and tax fraud, among others. To help prevent and detect fraud, individuals and organizations can take a number of steps. These may include conducting background checks on potential employees, carefully reviewing financial statements and transactions, and using fraud detection software and other tools to identify suspicious activity. It is also important to report suspected fraud to the appropriate authorities as soon as possible.
Early examples of fraud in history. Fraud is not a new phenomenon. Throughout history, people have been using various methods to deceive others for financial gain or personal benefits. In fact, some of the earliest examples of fraud can be traced back to ancient civilizations. One of the earliest known examples of fraud dates back to ancient Egypt, where scribes would falsify records and claim extra work for themselves in order to boost their pay. This practice was known as bending the reed, and it was punishable by law. In ancient Greece, fraudulent activities were also quite common. For example, merchants would often use weights and measures that were not standardized, giving them an unfair advantage in trade. Additionally, some individuals would sell counterfeit goods or make false claims about the quality of their products to deceive customers. During the Middle Ages, fraud continued to be a problem. One common scam was the sale of indulgences, which were supposed to reduce a person's time in purgatory. However, many of these indulgences were sold fraudulently, with little or no actual spiritual benefit to the purchaser. In more recent times, there have been numerous high-profile cases of fraud throughout history. For example, in the 19th century, the snake oil salesman was a common figure in the American West, selling fake medicines that were supposed to cure a variety of ailments. One of the most famous cases of fraud in the 20th century was the Charles Ponzi scheme, which involved convincing investors to invest in a fraudulent business by promising them high returns. Ponzi used the money from new investors to pay off earlier investors, creating the illusion of a profitable business. However, the scheme eventually collapsed, leaving many investors with significant losses. In the 21st century, fraud continues to be a problem, with new methods and techniques emerging all the time. From online scams to identity theft, fraudsters are always looking for new ways to deceive and defraud individuals and organizations.
The rise of white-collar crime, fraud in the modern era. White-collar crime refers to non-violent crimes committed by individuals or organizations for financial gain. It is a type of fraud that often involves deception, manipulation, and exploitation of trust. In the modern era, white-collar crime has become increasingly common, with new methods and techniques emerging all the time. One of the key factors driving the rise of white-collar crime is the increasing use of technology and the internet in business and commerce. For example, hackers and cybercriminals can use sophisticated techniques to gain access to sensitive information, such as bank account numbers and passwords. This information can then be used to commit various forms of fraud, including identity theft and financial fraud. Another factor contributing to the rise of white-collar crime is globalization. As businesses become more global in nature, they are often subject to different laws and regulations in different countries. This can create opportunities for individuals and organizations to engage in fraudulent activities that are difficult to detect and prosecute. In addition, the complexity of modern financial systems can make it difficult for regulators and law enforcement officials to identify and prevent fraud. For example, new financial instruments such as derivatives and hedge funds can be difficult to understand, making it easier for fraudsters to manipulate and exploit these systems for personal gain. One of the most high-profile cases of white-collar crime in recent years was the Bernie Madoff scandal, which involved a massive Ponzi scheme that defrauded thousands of investors out of billions of dollars. Madoff was eventually sentenced to 150 years in prison, but the case highlighted the scope and impact of white-collar crime in the modern era. To combat white-collar crime, governments and organizations around the world have implemented various measures, including increased regulation, improved oversight, and more sophisticated detection and enforcement mechanisms. However, as white-collar criminals continue to develop new and innovative ways to deceive and defraud, the fight against white-collar crime is likely to remain a constant challenge.
The Enron scandal, a case study in corporate fraud. The Enron scandal was one of the most high-profile cases of corporate fraud in recent history. Enron was an energy company that was once considered a major player in the industry, with revenues of over $100 billion. However, the company's financial success was built on a foundation of fraud and deception, and it ultimately collapsed in 2001, resulting in thousands of job losses and billions of dollars in losses for investors. At the heart of the Enron scandal was a complex web of fraudulent accounting practices and misleading financial reporting. Enron executives used various techniques to manipulate the company's financial statements, including off-balance sheet transactions, hiding debt, and inflating profits. These practices were designed to create the appearance of a successful and profitable company, even though the reality was far different. One of the key players in the Enron scandal was CFO Andrew Fastow, who created a series of off-balance sheet partnerships that allowed Enron to hide its debts and losses from investors. Fastow and other Enron executives were also accused of insider trading and other illegal activities. The Enron scandal had far-reaching impacts, both for the energy industry and for the broader business world. The scandal resulted in increased scrutiny of accounting practices and corporate governance and led to the passage of the Sarbanes-Oxley Act, which imposed stricter financial reporting requirements on publicly traded companies. The Enron scandal also highlighted the need for greater transparency and accountability in corporate governance. In the aftermath of the scandal, many companies and organizations implemented new measures to prevent fraud and promote ethical behavior, including improved reporting standards, stronger internal controls, and increased oversight by independent auditors.
The Ponzi scheme, history and impact. A Ponzi scheme is a type of investment fraud in which returns are paid to earlier investors using the capital contributed by new investors. The scheme is named after Charles Ponzi, who became infamous for running a massive fraudulent investment operation in the early 20th century. Ponzi schemes have been a recurring problem throughout history, causing significant financial losses for investors and creating widespread public distrust in financial institutions. The basic mechanics of a Ponzi scheme involve promising investors high returns on their investments, typically through investments in foreign currencies, real estate, or other unconventional financial instruments. The scheme relies on the willingness of new investors to contribute capital, which is then used to pay out returns to earlier investors. The scheme can only be sustained if there are enough new investors contributing capital to keep the returns flowing. One of the most famous examples of a Ponzi scheme is the Bernie Madoff scandal, which involved a massive fraud that lasted for decades and defrauded thousands of investors out of billions of dollars. Madoff used a Ponzi scheme to create the illusion of a successful investment business, promising investors steady returns and using new capital to pay out returns to earlier investors. The impact of Ponzi schemes can be devastating, both for individual investors and for the broader economy. Ponzi schemes often collapse when new investors are no longer willing to contribute capital, resulting in widespread losses for investors who were expecting high returns. The collapse of Ponzi schemes can also have a ripple effect throughout the financial system, leading to increased volatility and instability. To prevent and combat Ponzi schemes, governments and financial regulators around the world have implemented various measures, including increased regulation, improved oversight, and more sophisticated detection and enforcement mechanisms. However, as Ponzi schemers continue to develop new and innovative ways to deceive and defraud, the fight against Ponzi schemes is likely to remain a constant challenge.
Famous fraudsters, high-profile cases of fraud. Fraud is a pervasive and persistent problem that can affect individuals and organizations of all types and sizes. Over the years, there have been many high-profile cases of fraud that have captured public attention and highlighted the dangers of fraudulent activities. Here are some of the most famous fraudsters and their cases. Bernie Madoff. Madoff is perhaps the most infamous fraudster of all time. He operated a massive Ponzi scheme for decades, defrauding thousands of investors out of billions of dollars. He was sentenced to 150 years in prison in 2009. Jordan Belfort, also known as the Wolf of Wall Street, was a stockbroker who engaged in a variety of fraudulent activities, including securities fraud and money laundering. He was sentenced to 22 months in prison in 2003. Martin Shkreli. Shkreli was a pharmaceutical executive who gained notoriety for his company's decision to increase the price of a life-saving drug by 5,000%. He was later convicted of securities fraud and sentenced to 7 years in prison. Elizabeth Holmes. Holmes was the founder of the blood testing company Theranos, which was later revealed to be a massive fraud. Holmes and her partner were indicted on charges of wire fraud and conspiracy in 2018. Kenneth Lay and Jeffrey Skilling. Lay and Skilling were executives at Enron, an energy company that engaged in widespread accounting fraud. Both were convicted of multiple counts of fraud and conspiracy in 2006. These high-profile cases of fraud serve as a reminder of the importance of transparency, accountability, and ethical behavior in all areas of business and finance. By learning from these cases and implementing effective measures to prevent and combat fraud, we can help protect investors and promote a more secure and stable financial system.
The role of technology in modern fraud. Technology has transformed the way we live and work, but it has also created new opportunities for fraudsters to exploit. Today, technology is playing an increasingly important role in modern fraud, enabling criminals to perpetrate more sophisticated and complex scams than ever before. Here are some ways in which technology is being used in modern fraud. Phishing and social engineering. Fraudsters use email, social media, and other online platforms to trick people into divulging sensitive information, such as passwords or credit card numbers. They do this by sending fake emails that appear to be from legitimate sources, or by posing as someone else on social media. Malware and ransomware. Malware and ransomware are types of malicious software that are used to gain access to computer systems and steal sensitive data. Ransomware can be particularly devastating as it encrypts important files and demands payment in exchange for their release. Fake websites and apps. Fraudsters create fake websites and mobile apps that look like legitimate businesses or services, but are designed to steal personal information or payment details. Cryptocurrency fraud. Cryptocurrency is a relatively new and unregulated market that has attracted many fraudsters. They may create fake cryptocurrencies, use Ponzi schemes to defraud investors, or steal digital wallets containing cryptocurrency. Deepfake technology. Deepfake technology uses artificial intelligence to create videos or audio recordings that are indistinguishable from real ones. Fraudsters can use this technology to create fake videos or recordings of people, which they can then use to deceive others. As technology continues to advance, it is likely that fraudsters will continue to find new and innovative ways to exploit it. To combat modern fraud, individuals and organizations must remain vigilant and take proactive measures to protect themselves against these threats. This includes using strong passwords, keeping software up to date, being cautious when opening emails or clicking on links, and staying informed about the latest fraud trends and best practices.
Investment fraud, the rise of scams and schemes. Investment fraud is a growing problem that has been fueled by the rise of online investing and the increased popularity of alternative investments. Investment fraud typically involves the misrepresentation or omission of important information about an investment opportunity, with the goal of convincing investors to part with their money. Here are some of the most common types of investment fraud. Ponzi schemes. A Ponzi scheme is a fraudulent investment scheme in which returns are paid to earlier investors using the capital of newer investors. Eventually, the scheme collapses when there are not enough new investors to pay the returns owed to earlier investors. Pump and dump schemes. In a pump and dump scheme, fraudsters buy up shares of a low-priced stock and then promote it to potential investors, often using false or misleading information. Once the price of the stock rises, the fraudsters sell their shares, leaving other investors with worthless stock. Advance fee schemes. In an advance fee scheme, fraudsters promise investors high returns if they pay a fee upfront. However, once the fee is paid, the fraudsters disappear, and the promised returns never materialize. Foreign currency trading scams. Foreign currency trading scams involve the misrepresentation of the risks and returns associated with trading in the foreign currency markets. Fraudsters may promise investors high returns while downplaying the risks involved. Real estate investment schemes. Real estate investment schemes involve the misrepresentation of the risks and returns associated with investing in real estate. Fraudsters may claim to have inside information about upcoming real estate deals or promise investors high returns on real estate investments that do not actually exist. Investment fraud can have devastating consequences for individual investors and the broader financial system. To protect themselves against investment fraud, investors should be skeptical of any investment opportunity that sounds too good to be true, thoroughly research any investment before committing funds, and be wary of unsolicited investment offers from strangers. Additionally, investors should always work with reputable investment advisors and broker-dealers and report any suspected investment fraud to the appropriate authorities.
Healthcare fraud, a growing problem in the industry. Healthcare fraud is a significant and growing problem in the industry, affecting patients, providers, and payers alike. Healthcare fraud involves any intentional deception or misrepresentation related to healthcare services or products that result in unauthorized or unnecessary healthcare expenses. Here are some of the most common types of healthcare fraud. Billing fraud. Billing fraud involves the submission of false claims to insurance companies or government programs, such as Medicare or Medicaid. Examples of billing fraud include billing for services that were not provided, upcoding, billing for a higher priced service than what was provided, and unbundling, billing separately for services that should be billed together. Prescription fraud. Prescription fraud involves the unlawful prescribing, dispensing, or distribution of prescription drugs. This can include forging or altering prescriptions, selling prescription drugs on the black market, or prescribing unnecessary drugs for personal financial gain. Kickbacks and bribery. Kickbacks and bribery involve the payment of illegal or improper incentives in exchange for referrals or business. This can include offering or accepting bribes in exchange for patient referrals or receiving kickbacks for prescribing or using certain medical products or services. Medical identity theft. Medical identity theft involves the theft of an individual's personal or medical information for the purpose of committing healthcare fraud. This can include using someone else's insurance information to receive medical services or using a stolen medical provider's information to submit fraudulent claims. Unlicensed practice. Unlicensed practice involves the provision of healthcare services by individuals who are not licensed or authorized to do so. This can include individuals posing as doctors or other healthcare providers or operating unlicensed healthcare facilities. Healthcare fraud is a serious problem that can result in significant financial losses, as well as harm to patients who receive unnecessary or substandard care. To combat healthcare fraud, individuals and organizations must remain vigilant and take proactive measures to protect themselves against these threats. This includes being cautious when sharing personal or medical information, carefully reviewing medical bills and insurance claims, and reporting any suspected healthcare fraud to the appropriate authorities.
Fraud and corruption in politics. Examples from around the world. Fraud and corruption in politics are widespread problems that have plagued governments and societies around the world. Here are some examples of fraud and corruption in politics from different parts of the world. Brazil. In the Operation Car Wash scandal, Brazilian politicians and executives were found to have accepted bribes and kickbacks in exchange for awarding government contracts to construction companies. The scandal implicated dozens of high-level officials and led to the impeachment of President Dilma Rousseff. South Korea. In the Choi Soon-sil scandal, former South Korean President Park Geun-hye was impeached and removed from office for allowing her close friend, Choi Soon-sil, to influence government affairs and extort money from corporations. Russia, the Magnitsky Act, named after Russian lawyer Sergei Magnitsky, is a set of sanctions imposed by the United States on Russian officials accused of human rights abuses and corruption. Magnitsky had exposed a massive tax fraud scheme involving Russian officials and was subsequently imprisoned and died in custody. Kenya, in the Goldenberg scandal, Kenyan government officials and businessmen were found to have siphoned off billions of dollars from the national economy through fraudulent gold and diamond exports. The scandal led to a financial crisis and the collapse of the Kenyan shilling. Ukraine, the Yanukovych regime in Ukraine was accused of massive corruption, including embezzlement of state funds, bribery, and abuse of power. The regime was overthrown in the 2014 Ukrainian Revolution, and former President Viktor Yanukovych fled to Russia. Fraud and corruption in politics undermine the integrity of democratic institutions and have far-reaching consequences for society. To combat these problems, it is essential to have strong systems of transparency and accountability, as well as robust legal frameworks to investigate and prosecute corrupt officials. Additionally, civil society plays a critical role in exposing and challenging corruption, holding governments accountable, and promoting ethical and transparent governance.
The Bernie Madoff scandal, lessons learned. The Bernie Madoff scandal was one of the largest and most infamous cases of fraud in modern history. Here are some of the lessons learned from this scandal. Due diligence is essential. Investors need to do their due diligence when investing, even with seemingly reputable and successful investment managers like Bernie Madoff. Many investors were drawn to Madoff's consistent returns and reputation, but they did not perform adequate due diligence or question his investment strategy. Regulation and oversight are crucial. The Madoff scandal highlighted the need for greater regulation and oversight of the financial industry. It exposed weaknesses in the regulatory system, and regulatory bodies were criticized for failing to detect the fraud. The scandal led to the creation of the Dodd-Frank Wall Street Reform and Consumer Protection Act, which increased oversight of financial institutions and created the Consumer Financial Protection Bureau. Transparency is key. Madoff was able to carry out his fraud for decades because of the lack of transparency in his investment strategy. Investors were not provided with adequate information about the investments he was making on their behalf. Transparency is crucial in building trust between investors and investment managers. Whistleblowers play an important role. The Madoff scandal was ultimately exposed by whistleblowers, including Harry Markopolos, who had raised concerns about Madoff's investment strategy for years. Whistleblowers play a vital role in exposing fraud and corruption, and laws and regulations should protect them from retaliation. The importance of accountability. Madoff's conviction and sentencing to 150 years in prison sent a strong message about the consequences of financial fraud. Holding individuals and institutions accountable for their actions is essential in maintaining the integrity of the financial system. The Madoff scandal serves as a stark reminder of the importance of due diligence, regulation, transparency, whistleblowers, and accountability in the financial industry. It also highlights the need for ongoing efforts to combat financial fraud and corruption.
Fighting fraud, the role of law enforcement and regulation. Fighting fraud is a complex task that involves a variety of stakeholders, including law enforcement agencies and regulators. Here are some key aspects of the role of law enforcement and regulation in fighting fraud. Investigation and prosecution. Law enforcement agencies, such as the FBI, have the responsibility of investigating and prosecuting fraud cases. This involves gathering evidence, interviewing witnesses, and building a case against the alleged fraudsters. Once a case has been built, the prosecuting agency will seek to bring the alleged fraudster to trial and secure a conviction. Prevention and deterrence. Law enforcement agencies and regulators also play a role in preventing and deterring fraud. This can involve educating the public about common types of fraud, promoting best practices for fraud prevention, and enforcing laws and regulations designed to prevent fraud. Regulatory oversight. Regulatory agencies, such as the SEC or FINRA, have the responsibility of overseeing various industries and enforcing regulations designed to prevent fraud. This can involve conducting audits, investigating complaints, and taking enforcement actions against companies or individuals who violate regulations. Collaboration and information sharing. fighting fraud often requires collaboration and information sharing between various stakeholders. Law enforcement agencies and regulators may work together to share information about fraud trends and coordinate investigations. They may also work with private companies, such as banks or tech firms, to share information and prevent fraud.
The impact of fraud on society and the economy. Fraud can have significant impacts on both society and the economy. Here are some key ways in which fraud can impact society and the economy. Financial losses. Fraud can result in significant financial losses for individuals, businesses, and governments. In some cases, these losses can be substantial enough to lead to bankruptcy or financial ruin. Erosion of trust. Fraud can erode trust in institutions and systems. This can result in people being less likely to invest, do business, or engage in other activities that rely on trust. This erosion of trust can have long-lasting effects on the economy and society. Harm to individuals and communities. Fraud can cause harm to individuals and communities. This can include the loss of homes, jobs, and other assets, as well as psychological harm such as stress and anxiety. Damage to the reputation of businesses and industries. Fraud can damage the reputation of businesses and industries, making it more difficult for them to attract customers and investors. This can lead to reduced economic activity and job losses. Increased regulatory costs. Fraud can lead to increased regulatory costs as governments and regulatory agencies try to prevent and investigate fraud. These costs can be passed on to consumers and businesses, leading to higher prices and reduced economic activity. Loss of tax revenue. Fraud can result in a loss of tax revenue for governments, as fraudulent activities may go unreported and untaxed. This can lead to reduced government services and higher taxes for law-abiding citizens.
Conclusion: moving forward in the fight against fraud. In conclusion, fraud is a serious issue that can have significant impacts on society and the economy. However, there are many stakeholders working to fight fraud and mitigate its effects. Law enforcement agencies, regulators, businesses, and individuals all have a role to play in preventing and detecting fraud. Moving forward, there are several key steps that can be taken to further the fight against fraud. These include: educating the public. Education and awareness campaigns can help to prevent fraud by teaching people how to recognize and avoid fraudulent schemes. Strengthening regulations. Governments and regulatory agencies can work to strengthen regulations and enforcement mechanisms to prevent fraud and punish fraudsters. Enhancing technology. Advancements in technology, such as blockchain and artificial intelligence, can be used to detect and prevent fraud more effectively. Encouraging collaboration. Collaboration between stakeholders, such as law enforcement agencies, regulators, and businesses, can help to share information and prevent fraud. Holding fraudsters accountable. Holding fraudsters accountable through prosecution and punishment can help to deter future fraud. By taking these steps and continuing to work together, we can make progress in the fight against fraud and create a more fair and secure society and economy.